All right, so today we're diving deep into hunting regulations.
Ooh, fun.
Well, maybe not fun, but very important, you know?
Right, crucial even.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking bag limits today and using a couple sources to help us out here.
Sounds good.
So we've got the official Canadian hunting regulations
Always.
and then this really great Q&A
Oh, cool.
from the BC government.
Excellent.
Yeah, so by the end of this, you'll be able to confidently explain the difference between
yeah.
daily bag limits and possession limits.
I like it.
So you can impress your hunting buddies with all this knowledge.
Yeah, there's definitely more to these rules than meets the eye, right? Like, it's not just arbitrary. It's really about conservation and being responsible when we're out there hunting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't just go out and bag every bird you see.
Nope.
So let's just start with the basics.
Yep.
The daily bag limit.
Right.
And I always think of this like a daily spending allowance, but for birds.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
It's basically setting that clear limit on how many birds you can harvest in one day.
Mm-hmm.
And a really important thing to remember is that it's species specific.
Oh, right.
Like, you can't just go out and shoot any 8 birds and call it a day. It all depends on what you're actually hunting.
So what about ducks, for example?
Okay, so for ducks, the daily bag limit's 8 in total.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
You can only take 4 canvasbacks.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Why is there a special restriction on those?
Well, it's all about sustainability and making sure we're managing those populations properly.
Mm-hmm.
Canvasbacks, for a variety of reasons, they might be a little more sensitive to hunting pressure than some other types of ducks.
So, are their populations lower than other types of ducks?
They could be, yeah. Or there might be other kind of ecological factors at play, things like habitat availability or, specific breeding patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And by setting a lower limit on canvasbacks, those regulations are trying to help ensure, healthy and thriving populations.
Got it. So it's not just some random number. They're really thinking about the specific needs of each species when they're setting these limits.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our daily limit all sorted out.
Right.
What happens when you've been hunting for a few days? Where does the possession limit come in?
Yeah, so the possession limit is referring to the total number of unpreserved birds you can have at any time.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter if they're at home in your car, wherever that possession limit is your overall carrying limit, even after you've finished hunting for the day.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So let's say I'm on a multi-day hunting trip.
Yeah.
I can bag up to my daily limit each day.
Yep.
But I also have to make sure that over the whole trip, I'm not going over my possession limit.
Exactly. And that's where it can get a little tricky sometimes.
Oh, okay.
Because the possession limit is usually higher than the daily bag limit.
Oh, okay.
It's designed for multi-day hunts, but you still have to stay within those regulations.
Okay, I see. So why even have both a daily limit and a possession limit? It seems a bit redundant, doesn't it?
It might seem that way at first, but there's a really important reason for having both.
Okay.
This is where conservation really comes into play.
Okay.
So imagine if there were no possession limits, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hunters could potentially harvest their daily limit every single day for the entire season, and that could have a really devastating impact on bird populations.
So it's kind of like a safeguard against overhunting.
Exactly.
You can enjoy a longer hunting trip, but you're still limited in the total number of birds that you can take.
Exactly. And remember those specific limits on canvasbacks.
Yeah.
Having both a daily and a possession limit provides a more nuanced approach to managing the impact of hunting.
Okay.
It helps make sure that hunting remains sustainable and that it benefits both the hunters and the wildlife populations they're relying on.
That makes a lot more sense now.
Good.
It's all about finding that balance, right? Allowing people to enjoy the sport, but making sure that those populations are protected for the long term.
Exactly. And to make things even more interesting, there's this unique shorthand they use in the BC regulations.
Oh, really?
You might see something like 2-1 in parentheses for ungulates.
2-1. What is that? Some kind of math problem?
Yeah, it looks confusing at first.
Yeah.
But it's actually quite simple.
Okay.
So 2-1 means that the season bag limit is 2 animals of that species.
Okay.
But only 1 can be without antlers.
So if you're out hunting deer, for example, you can take 2 in total for the entire season.
Right.
But only 1 of those can be antlerless.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's all laid out in the regulations, and it's important to read them carefully.
Right.
You might also see something like 10-20 in parentheses for game birds.
10-20, what would that be?
Any guesses?
10-20, daily limit of 10?
Yes.
And a possession limit of 20.
You got it.
Okay.
So it's just a compact way of presenting the information, but It highlights why it's so important to really understand what those regulations are saying.
Yeah, don't just skim through them.
Yeah.
Like, really take the time to read it.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Now, speaking of regulations, one thing that I noticed in the Canadian regulations is that possession limits apply to everyone, not just hunters.
Oh, interesting.
Why is that? It seems a little odd.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It likely ties back to preventing any illegal sale or trade of wild game.
Okay.
Extending those limits to everyone, even non-hunters, helps create a clear legal framework for responsible practices across the board.
So even if, like, someone gifts you a wild bird, you're still bound by those possession limits.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It really underscores the idea that these regulations aren't just about hunting. They're about responsible wildlife management, and that applies to everyone.
Right, because we're all part of this, like, larger ecosystem.
Exactly.
And we all need to be mindful of how our actions impact it.
I agree. Absolutely. And, we've been talking a lot about birds, but these concepts of bag limits and possession limits, they're just as important when it comes to other game species, like those ungulates we mentioned earlier.
Right. Okay, yeah, I was curious about that.
Yeah.
How do things work for, say, deer or elk?
Well, just like with birds, there are specific daily bag limits and possession limits for each species of ungulate.
Okay.
And those limits are carefully set to ensure that we're harvesting sustainably, not putting too much pressure on any one population.
So, like, those limits would be different depending on the type of ungulate and where you're hunting.
Absolutely. For instance, in some areas, you might be allowed to harvest 2 deer per season, while in other areas the limit might be 1.
Okay.
And just like with that 2-1 notation, there might be restrictions on how many of those can be antlerless.
Right. It makes sense that the regulations would vary depending on the specific species and the region.
Exactly. It all comes down to managing those populations. Effectively taking into account things like population size, habitat conditions, even things like predator-prey dynamics.
Wow, I'm starting to see how much thought and research goes into setting these bag limits.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just like a one-size-fits-all approach.
Not at all. It's a complex process that involves wildlife biologists, conservationists, and a deep understanding of the ecosystems involved.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, right? Ensuring that hunting remains a sustainable practice that benefits both the hunters and the wildlife populations they rely on.
That's the goal. And to make things even more interesting, sometimes these regulations can change from year to year.
Oh, really? Why would they do that?
Well, wildlife populations can fluctuate due to various factors.
Mm-hmm.
Things like weather patterns, disease outbreaks, or changes in habitat.
Okay.
So if a particular species is experiencing a decline, the bag limits might be reduced to help the population recover.
Okay.
Conversely, if a population is thriving, the limits might be increased slightly.
So it's an ongoing process of monitoring and adjusting to ensure that things stay sustainable.
It's all about adapting to the ever-changing dynamics of the natural world.
It's amazing to see how all of this ties back to conservation. These regulations aren't just about, like, following rules.
Right.
They're really about protecting and preserving wildlife for future generations.
I couldn't agree more. It's about recognizing that we have a responsibility to manage these resources wisely and ensure that hunting remains a sustainable tradition.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we get to enjoy the thrill of the hunt, but we also have a duty to act as stewards of the environment.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between our own enjoyment and the long-term health of the ecosystems we rely on.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the what and the why of bag limits, but I'm curious about how do these regulations actually get enforced?
That's a great question. Conservation officers play a crucial role in enforcing these regulations.
Oh, okay.
They're out there in the field, monitoring hunting activity and ensuring that everyone is following the rules.
So they're kind of like the referees of the hunting world, making sure everyone is playing fair.
That's a good way to put it. They have the authority to check hunting licenses, inspect harvested game, and issue citations to anyone who's breaking the rules.
It sounds like a pretty important job.
Yeah.
Do they have any special tools or techniques that they use for enforcing these bag limits?
Definitely. They use a variety of methods.
Okay.
For example, they might set up checkpoints in popular hunting areas to inspect harvested game and ensure that hunters are staying within their limits.
Okay.
They can also use aerial surveillance to monitor hunting activity in more remote areas.
Wow. So they're using all sorts of technology to keep things in check.
Absolutely. And it's not just about catching people who are breaking the rules.
Mm.
It's also about educating hunters about the importance of conservation
Right.
and the role they play in maintaining healthy wildlife populations.
So it's about raising awareness and fostering a sense of responsibility.
Exactly. It's about working together to ensure that hunting remains a sustainable and ethical practice.
That's really encouraging to hear. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the specifics of daily bag limits and possession limits to the broader conservation implications,
Yeah.
and even how those regulations are enforced.
We've really gone deep on this
Yeah, we have. But before we wrap things up, there's one more thing I'd like to touch on.
one. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the legal aspects of bag limits,
Right.
but what about the ethical considerations?
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Even within the legal limits, there's always an ethical dimension to consider.
Like, how many animals do you really need to take? Is it always necessary to harvest your full limit?
Exactly. It's about being mindful and making responsible choices.
Hmm.
It's about respecting the animals we hunt
Yeah.
and recognizing that we have a role to play in maintaining a healthy balance in the natural world.
I think that's a great point to ponder. Just because you can take a certain number of animals doesn't necessarily mean you should.
Absolutely. It's about asking yourself what feels right to me,
Hmm.
what aligns with my own values and ethics as a hunter.
It's about seeing yourself as a steward of the environment and making choices that reflect that responsibility.
Well said.
Yeah, it's like we're all part of this incredible tapestry,
Mhm.
and every action we take has a ripple effect, on the whole ecosystem.
That's a beautiful way to put it, and it brings us right back to the heart of this deep dive, understanding bag limits.
Yeah.
It's not just about knowing the rules.
Right.
It's about being a, conscious and responsible hunter.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we have a role to play in conservation
Yeah.
and that our choices can have a real impact on the future of these species.
It's about seeing that bigger picture. We're not just out there for ourselves.
Right.
We're part of a larger community that includes the animals we hunt, the environment they live in, and the generations that will come after us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what would you say is the most important thing for listeners to take away from all of this?
I'd say the key takeaway is this: knowledge is power. The more you understand about bag limits,
Yeah.
the reasons behind them, and the impact they have, the better equipped you'll be to make informed and responsible decisions when you're actually out there in the field.
That's such a crucial point. It's not just about blindly following the rules.
Right.
It's about understanding why those rules exist and making choices that align with, your own values and ethics.
Exactly. And remember, those regulations are there for a reason.
Yeah.
They're based on scientific research,
Mm-hmm.
careful monitoring, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance of our ecosystems.
So whether you're a seasoned hunter or just starting out, it's always worth taking the time to review those regulations.
Of course.
Stay up to date on any changes and, really make sure you're comfortable with what's being asked of you.
Absolutely. And if you ever have any questions or doubts,
Yeah.
don't hesitate to reach out to your local wildlife agency or conservation officers.
Yeah, they're a great resource.
They really are.
Now, before we sign off,
Okay.
I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on.
Right.
We've talked about, respecting the legal bag limits.
Right.
But what about the idea of setting personal limits that go even further?
I love that question. It really gets to the heart of ethical hunting.
Yeah.
It's about asking yourself what feels right to me,
Mm-hmm.
what aligns with my own values and principles, even if it means taking less than the legal limit allows.
It's about recognizing that sometimes the most rewarding hunts are the ones where we prioritize conservation
Yeah.
and the well-being of the wildlife over, our own personal gain.
Beautifully said. It's about finding that balance between our passion for hunting and our responsibility to be stewards of the environment.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the world of bag limits.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
And to all our listeners out there, happy hunting, stay safe,
Yeah.
and always remember to hunt responsibly